My uncle was buried with that. Jamal's voice cut through the afternoon heat like a knife, his oil-stained finger pointing directly at the vintage Patek Philippe gleaming on the wrist of the man in front of him. Sheikh Omar al-Mansouri stood frozen, his arm still raised where he had been checking the time, his expression shifting from confusion to something darker. The watch caught the Dubai sunlight, its intricate gold face and worn leather band telling a story that shouldn't be possible. Behind them, the Tiffany blue Lamborghini Huracan sat like a monument to wealth, parked outside Jamal's modest body shop in a neighborhood where cars like that didn't belong. This moment, this impossible recognition, would unravel a conspiracy that had destroyed one family and built another's fortune. But to understand how a 28-year-old mechanic from Detroit came to recognize a watch that should have been 6 feet underground, we need to go back 15 years to the day Jamal's uncle, Marcus Williams, died under suspicious circumstances. Marcus had been a chemical engineer, one of the few black men to rise to a senior position at Hexagon Industries, a corporation that held patents worth billions. He was brilliant, principled, and working on something that would have revolutionized water purification in developing countries. The technology was cheap to manufacture, required no electricity, and could provide clean water for pennies per person. It would have saved millions of lives, but it also would have destroyed the market for expensive filtration systems that companies like Hexagon sold to governments and NGOs for enormous profits. Marcus knew what his invention meant, and he knew the danger. 3 weeks before he died, he visited 13-year-old Jamal and pressed something into his hand. It was the Patek Philippe, a watch that had belonged to Marcus's grandfather, who had bought it with his first real paycheck after World War II. "This watch has been in our family for 70 years, Marcus said, his voice serious in a way that frightened young Jamal. If anything happens to me, you remember who I gave this to. You remember what I was working on. You remember that some things are worth more than money." Jamal didn't understand then. He wore the watch every day, proud to carry his uncle's legacy. 2 weeks later, Marcus was dead. The official story was suicide. Depression, they said. Work stress. But Jamal's family knew better. Marcus had no history of mental illness. He was excited about his work, talking about the lives he would save. And the circumstances were wrong. He allegedly jumped from his office building, but there were no witnesses, no note, and the security footage from that evening was mysteriously corrupted. The police investigation lasted 3 days before being closed. At the funeral, Jamal wore the Patek Philippe. His mother, Patricia, cried through the entire service. And as the casket was being closed, Patricia made a decision. She took the watch from Jamal's wrist. "He should have this," she said through tears. It was his father's. He should be buried with something from his family. Jamal protested. But he was 13 and grieving. The casket was sealed. Marcus was buried with the Patek Philippe on his wrist. Jamal never saw it again. Until today, 15 years later, on the wrist of a billionaire, standing in front of his body shop. "How?" Jamal said, his voice shaking with rage and confusion. "How do you have that watch?" Sheikh Omar lowered his arm slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about. This watch belonged to my father." Jamal stepped closer, his hands clenched into fists. "Your father? My uncle was buried with that watch 15 years ago. I watched them close the casket. I watched them lower him into the ground. So either you're lying or you dug up my uncle's grave, and I want to know which one it is." Omar's jaw tightened. "You're mistaken. Many watches look similar. This is a common model." Jamal laughed, a harsh sound with no humor in it. "Common? That's a 1947 Patek Philippe Calatrava with a custom engraving on the back. My great-grandfather had his initials put there when he bought it. MEW Marcus Edward Williams. You want to take it off and prove me wrong?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Omar's hand moved protectively over the watch, and in that gesture, Jamal saw guilt. Around them, the body shop had gone quiet. Jamal's 2 employees, Carlos and Deshaun, had stopped working and were watching. A small crowd was gathering on the street, drawn by the raised voices and the exotic car. Omar seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation. He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. You're harassing me and making false accusations. I could have you arrested." Jamal didn't back down. "Call whoever you want. But that watch is stolen property, and I'm not letting you leave with it. What happened next happened fast. Omar tried to get into his Lamborghini, but Jamal blocked the door. Omar shoved him, and Jamal shoved back harder. Deshaun pulled out his phone and started recording. Someone in the crowd called the police. And in the struggle, the watch band broke, sending the Patek Philippe skittering across the pavement. Both men froze, then dove for it. Jamal got there first, his fingers closing around the warm metal. He flipped it over, and there, worn but unmistakable, were the engraved initials, M.E.W. His hands were shaking as he held up the watch. Explain this. Explain how your father's watch has my great-grandfather's initials. Omar's face had gone pale. The crowd pressed closer, phones out, recording everything. In the distance, sirens wailed. Omar seemed to realize that whatever story he had been preparing to tell wouldn't work. Not with this evidence, not with witnesses and cameras everywhere. His shoulders sagged slightly. I bought it, he said quietly. 5 years ago, from an estate sale. I didn't know where it came from. Jamal's eyes narrowed. What estate sale? Whose estate? Omar hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. A man named Richard Hexagon, the CEO of Hexagon Industries. He died, and his collection was sold off privately. I bought several pieces. This was one of them. The name hit Jamal like a physical blow. Hexagon Industries, his uncle's employer, the company that had ruled Marcus's death a suicide and fought to keep his patents. The company that had made billions from water filtration technology that was less effective and more expensive than what Marcus had been developing. Suddenly, pieces that had never fit began sliding into place. Why would the CEO of Hexagon Industries have my uncle's watch? Jamal's voice was dangerous now, the anger giving way to something colder and more focused. A watch that was supposed to be buried with him? Omar shook his head. I don't know. I just bought it. I didn't ask questions. The police arrived then, 2 officers stepping out of their patrol car to assess the situation. The crowd explained in overlapping voices. Stolen watch. Grave robbing. Dead uncle. Billionaire. The officers looked overwhelmed. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes, took control. Everybody quiet. She looked at Jamal. You're claiming this watch was stolen? Jamal held up the Patek Philippe, showed her the engraving, and told her the story. His uncle's death, the funeral, the burial, and now, 15 years later, seeing it on a stranger's wrist. The officer took photos of the engraving and asked Omar for his identification and proof of purchase. Omar provided documents showing he had indeed bought the watch from the Hexagon estate sale 5 years prior. Everything appeared legitimate on the surface. The officer looked between them. This is complicated. The watch was legally purchased, but if it was taken from a grave, that's a crime. We need to investigate. She turned to Jamal. Do you have proof your uncle was buried with this watch? Jamal felt his certainty waver. Did he? It had been 15 years. He had been a child. But then he remembered something. My mother. She took it off my wrist at the funeral. The funeral home would have records. There might be photos. The officer nodded. We're going to need you both to come to the station and make statements. In the meantime, the watch is evidence. She held out an evidence bag, and reluctantly, Jamal dropped the Patek Philippe into it. Over the next 3 days, Jamal became obsessed. He contacted the funeral home, which still had records showing that Marcus Williams had been buried with a Patek Philippe watch, description matching. He found his mother's old photos from the funeral, and in one blurry image, you could see the watch on Marcus's wrist in the casket. He hired a lawyer, a sharp black woman named Keisha Robinson, who specialized in property theft and had a reputation for taking on powerful opponents. And he started digging into Richard Hexagon's death and estate. What he found was disturbing. Richard Hexagon had died of a heart attack 7 years ago, just 2 years after Marcus's death. His estate had been vast, including a collection of luxury watches worth millions. The collection had been sold at a private auction, and many pieces had gone to wealthy Middle Eastern buyers, including Sheikh Omar al-Mansouri. But there was no record of how Richard Hexagon had acquired the Patek Philippe. No receipt, no previous owner listed, nothing. It had simply appeared in his collection sometime between Marcus's death and his own. Keisha filed a motion to exhume Marcus's body. If the watch wasn't in the grave, It would prove it had been removed, and that would open a criminal investigation into how it had ended up in Richard Hexagon's possession. The motion was opposed immediately by Hexagon Industries, now run by Richard's son David. Their lawyers argued it was disrespectful to the dead, that Jamal's claims were speculative, that the watch could have been a similar model. But the judge, an older black man named Harold Wright who remembered when black engineers were rare and often met suspicious ends, approved the exhumation. The day they opened Marcus's grave, Jamal stood with his parents in the cemetery, all of them silent and tense. The casket was raised, opened carefully by investigators wearing protective gear. Marcus's body, preserved better than expected by the sealed casket and embalming, was clearly visible. His suit was still intact, his hands were folded across his chest, and his left wrist was bare. No watch. The absence was documented with photographs. The investigators sealed the casket again and returned Marcus to the ground, but the damage was done. The watch had been removed from the grave, which meant someone had either dug up the body or removed it before burial. The investigation exploded from there. Keisha filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Hexagon Industries, arguing that the watch's presence in Richard Hexagon's collection proved he had been involved in Marcus's death. The police reopened the 15-year-old case, and the media, sensing a story about corporate corruption and a murdered black engineer, descended like locusts. Under pressure, Hexagon Industries' current leadership tried to distance themselves from their former CEO. David Hexagon released a statement claiming he had no knowledge of how his father acquired the watch and was cooperating fully with investigators. But it was too late. The story had captured public attention, and people started asking questions. A former Hexagon employee, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had worked with Marcus, came forward. She had been afraid for 15 years, but now she felt safe speaking. She told investigators that Marcus had discovered his revolutionary technology was being deliberately suppressed by Richard Hexagon, who had financial stakes in the existing, more expensive filtration systems. Marcus had threatened to go public and release his patents independently. 3 days later, he was dead. Dr. Chen had suspected murder but had been too frightened to speak up. She had been threatened subtly by Richard Hexagon himself, told that accidents happened to people who didn't understand business realities. But now, with Richard dead and the truth coming out, she provided emails, documents, and recordings that painted a picture of corporate corruption and likely murder. The watch, investigators theorized, had been taken as a trophy. Richard Hexagon had been known for his arrogance, his belief that he was untouchable. Taking a murdered man's watch and wearing it was exactly the kind of power move a man like that would make. It was a reminder to himself and anyone who knew the truth that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. The case built slowly but inevitably. Hexagon Industries settled the wrongful death lawsuit for $47 million, admitting no guilt, but effectively acknowledging that something terrible had happened. The settlement was structured to provide for Marcus's family and to fund water purification projects in developing countries using Marcus's original technology, which was finally being released from the patents Hexagon had buried. Sheikh Omar al-Mansouri was cleared of any wrongdoing. He had purchased the watch in good faith, unaware of its history. He voluntarily returned it to Jamal's family and made a substantial donation to the water purification fund in Marcus's name. The two men met one more time in Keisha's office to complete the transfer. Omar looked tired, older than he had that day outside the body shop. "I want you to know I had no idea," he said quietly. "If I had known where that watch came from, I never would have bought it." "No one should profit from another man's murder." Jamal nodded, accepting the apology. "You were just unlucky enough to be the one wearing it when I saw it, but I'm glad it happened. Without that moment, we never would have known the truth." Omar handed over the watch, now in a simple box. "Your uncle's work is going to save lives now. That's the legacy that matters." After he left, Jamal sat alone with the Patek Philippe. He opened the case and looked at the watch that had started everything. The gold was tarnished, the leather band had been replaced, but the engraving was still clear. M.E.W. He thought about Marcus, about the brilliant mind that had been silenced, because it threatened profits. He thought about the 15 years his family had spent grieving without justice, believing the lie that Marcus had killed himself. And he thought about the strange chain of events that had brought the truth to light. Jamal's mother cried when he brought the watch home. She held it like it was made of glass, her fingers tracing the engraving. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing, burying him with it." "You were," Jamal said. "If you hadn't, we never would have known it was missing. Everything happened exactly the way it needed to. The watch never went back in a grave. Instead, it was displayed in a small museum dedicated to black inventors and engineers. Alongside Marcus's story and examples of the water purification technology he had created, a plaque explained how his murder had been covered up and how justice had finally come 15 years later through the discovery of a stolen watch. Jamal's body shop became something of a landmark after the story went national. People would stop by to see the place where the confrontation had happened, where a mechanic had recognized an impossible thing and refused to let it go. Business increased, and Jamal was able to expand, hiring more workers and training young people from the neighborhood in automotive repair. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel can reach more people like you. Now, back to the story. But more importantly, he became an advocate for reopening cold cases involving suspicious deaths of black professionals in corporate environments. Working with Keisha and a network of lawyers and investigators, he helped several families find answers about loved ones whose deaths had been ruled suicides or accidents, but had never made sense. Each time truth replaced lies, Jamal felt like he was honoring his uncle's memory. 2 years after the confrontation outside his shop, Jamal was invited to speak at a conference on corporate accountability. He stood on stage in front of hundreds of people and told Marcus's story. He talked about how systemic injustice works, how people in power can make someone disappear and face no consequences, how truth can be buried literally and figuratively. But he also talked about the importance of remembering, of paying attention, of trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. "My uncle told me to remember," Jamal said, his voice carrying through the auditorium. He knew he was in danger, and he wanted someone to know the truth if anything happened to him. "For 15 years, I thought I had failed him. But the truth is, you never really forget. It stays with you, waiting for the moment when it can come to light. All you have to do is be ready to recognize it when it appears." Years later, when Jamal's own daughter was born, he named her Marcella, a feminine version of Marcus. On her first birthday, he took her to the museum where the Patek Philippe was displayed. He held her up so she could see the watch, though she was too young to understand. "This belonged to your great-uncle Marcus," he told her. "He was a brilliant man who tried to help people, and bad people killed him for it. But the truth came out eventually, because someone recognized something that shouldn't have existed. The Patek Philippe sat in its case, a silent witness to everything that had happened. It had traveled from a World War II veteran's wrist to his grandson's, then into a grave, then to a CEO's collection as a trophy of murder, then to a billionaire's wrist in innocent ignorance, and finally to a museum where it could tell its story to anyone who would listen. It was just a watch, just metal and leather and mechanism, but it had become something more through the meaning people gave it. It was a family heirloom, a piece of evidence, a symbol of injustice and eventual justice, a reminder that even when powerful people try to bury the truth, sometimes, impossibly, it finds its way back to the light. And sometimes all it takes is one person, standing outside a body shop on a sunny afternoon, recognizing something that shouldn't exist and having the courage to say, "My uncle was buried with that." Everything else follows from that moment of recognition, that refusal to accept the impossible, that insistence on truth even when truth seems lost forever.